All right. Welcome again to everybody. We appreciate you coming. Feel free to use the chat to share where you're from. Jordan Fields, the TU Aquatic Resiliency Scientist, is going to be sharing about river recovery in the wake of large floods. But one of the questions he had is where people are from and what you came to, or why you came to the presentation, what it is you'd like to take away from the presentation. There we go. Hi, Tony and Tim. Jordan, I'm going to let you take over. Please, again to everybody, please use the Q&A for the questions that you have, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation after Jordan's done. Thank you, Jordan.
Great. Right on. I'm seeing a lot of diverse places on here as far away as Anchorage, Alaska,
Yeah.
Iowa, the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. I'm from Central Vermont, as you'll hear about. So, and then a lot of folks who are in the footprint of Helene, which is what we're going to be thinking a little bit about today. So that's great. Awesome. Keep it coming. I'd love to kind of go through the chat after and see where everyone is from. So Doug, am I good to take it away?
Yes, you are good to take it away. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, folks, thanks for having me on today. I'm Jordan Fields. Have been at TU for about 9 months now after finishing up my PhD at Dartmouth College in fluvial geomorphology. And so my bailiwick is thinking about how rivers respond to disturbance generally. But in particular, a lot of my work has focused on how rivers respond to large floods. And my interest in that comes from both a science perspective and a personal perspective. So from the science perspective, I'm really interested in how sediment moves through rivers, when it moves through rivers, and what that can tell us about what's changing on the landscape as a whole. I always say to folks, I didn't choose to study sediment transport because it was the most boring topic I could think of, although that's generally folks' first reaction. But rather, sediment transport is kind of like taking the temperature of a watershed. You can tell how that watershed is being affected by land use changes like grazing, mining, deforestation, climate change, large floods, you name it. That signal is going to be processed through the ways in which that rivers transport sediment. And as I said, this is more than just a science exercise for me, though. I grew up in Woodstock, Vermont, right near this bridge called the Tassville Covered Bridge, kind of an idyllic spot. But my interest in rivers started on a single day in 2011. For folks here from the Northeast, you might remember Tropical Storm Irene. This is what that bridge looked like on August 28th, 2011. So the bridge deck is generally about 35 feet above the water level on a calm day. But on this day, all 35 feet were taken up by that flood. And that event really just changed the way that I saw rivers. And it made me wonder about where does this sediment come from and what will happen if my hometown experiences floods like this more frequently and the floods become more intense. And so as I was digging out my neighbors and friends' houses from meters of sediment, I just kept wondering. And so I spent the last 12 years or so trying to figure that out. And that original hunch that these storms were going to get more intense and more frequent was true. And in the last year of my PhD, we had a similar event. So here's the same spot in July 10th, 2023. So the point being that my interest in rivers and river restoration comes out of the fact that I've been there firsthand and understood how these floods have such a devastating effect on both the river corridors, on the people as well. The last bit I'll add about Irene, though, was that the most impactful part of that storm was not the storm itself, but it was the quote restoration that took place immediately after that storm. The governor of Vermont lifted all in-stream regulations and the stream was pillaged for gravel. My home river, the Ottaquiche, my dad and I grew up fishing that together about a mile and a half from our house, and we haven't been able to fish there since because they took all the gravel out of the river and piled it up on the sides and made this drainage ditch, basically. And since that time, Vermont has taken totally opposite course and has one of the most progressive stream restoration programs in the country, and we'll talk a little bit about that program. But the legacy of the mistakes made in those first months and years after Irene is still having its toll on river corridors in Vermont. So my intent with the talk tonight is to kind of talk through some of the lessons learned in the wake of Irene, both from a policy perspective and a science perspective. So I always like to say that floods are devastating, but from a river restoration perspective, they're also an opportunity. We know that in natural river corridors, they're just that. They're a corridor. They're not a channel. They're complex. They take up the whole valley bottom. They are sometimes single threaded, but they are often have many different channels and ponded areas. And what we've done through the legacy of the Industrial Revolution and creating mills and needing more power at a single point, and as a legacy of land use change from forest to grazing land, is we've taken these rivers and simplified them and made them, simple single thread things. I know everyone here has heard this story before, and I don't need to hammer home the point, but it is true that floods are an opportunity because they take us out of this simplified world because the rivers are reunited with their floodplain in these moments. And so what we're left with after a flood is actually potentially an enhanced ecosystem, even though it initially looks devastated. So I'm going to walk through how science actually backs that up a little bit. One of the papers that I've been really keen on that just came out this summer addresses this question directly. And they looked at how a flood affected riverine habitat and water fluxes and sediment fluxes in a stream in Spain. And to cut to the chase, basically found that this large flood rejuvenated pools, habitat diversity, benefited native species, and increased hyporheic exchange. That's groundwater, surface water exchange that leads to better water quality, and decreased the presence of invasive species. So floods, while they're devastating in the moment, and we need to keep our focus on restoring the communities that have been devastated, we can't lose sight of that, right? But at the same time, while we build back up our communities and help our neighbors and our friends and the businesses that have been affected by this, we also have an opportunity to do so in a way that will both improve the ecosystem as well as mitigate damage in the future. So there are kind of two factors that I think about having floods being an opportunity to restore or enhance. The first of those is floodplain connectivity, right? As we mentioned, rivers are often channelized and disconnected from their floodplain. The other one is stream habitat and complexity. And these are really just two sides of the same coin. When a floodplain is well connected, sediment and wood come into the stream, which creates more complex habitat and morphologies, which pushes water back onto the floodplain. And so they feed into each other. And the benefits of emphasizing floodplain connectivity and stream complexity is that we can mitigate future floods, which I'll talk a little bit more in detail soon. We can store sediment on the floodplain, and we can push water into the ground, which filters it and improves water quality, and as well as improve habitat. So in the 13 years since Irene happened, myself and my colleagues at Dartmouth College, where I did my PhD, have been focusing on the lasting effects of Irene, trying to think about how did this devastating flood leave a mark on the landscape, and how has that changed the way the rivers behave? So we've been monitoring stream morphology, the hill slope stability of large landslides like this one pictured at right, the sediment flux from those large landslides, and we've been pairing those observations with models and using full-scale experiments like dam removals to simulate how rivers recover after large storms. We can't just conjure up an Irene whenever we want and go make observations. And it's probably good that we can't, because it left a pretty big scar on the community, right? So instead, we've used dam removals, which are very similar to large floods, because you have a system that's in one state, a dam's removed, it's in a totally different state, overwhelmed by sediment. It's reworking those sediments, no vegetation. It's a very good analog. And finally, we used the monitoring we did, the full-scale experiments with dam removals to inform computational models to think about, in a changing climate, what kind of outcomes can we expect of future floods if we restore rivers? So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to kind of bury the lead here and just talk about my big takeaways right now, so that everyone can kind of get on the same page. So the first guiding principle is that rivers need room to move. And this is one of the main lessons learned in the state of Vermont in the wake of Irene. So on this right-hand side is the don't panel, right? That's what happened in Vermont immediately after Irene. As my advisor, Frank McGilligan, likes to say, he's like, the boys with the toys got in there, the backhoes and the graders, and they built levees and dams. And I can understand why. It's a perfectly reasonable gut reaction. When your home has been destroyed, your road's been taken out, you want to discipline that river and put it back in its place. But in reality, what happens is you create a channel that is just a gun barrel. It's allowing the river to move more quickly, get deeper. And like a runaway train, eventually it will jump the tracks. It will jump the levee. And when it does so, it'll have more power than it ever would have if we restored the floodplain, the whole river corridor, not just the channel, as is seen on the left, where that river has room to adjust and flood. So this has been a lot of my thinking on this, a lot of everyone's thinking in the Northeast has been led by this really amazing guy named Mike Klein. He was the river program manager at the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about his work today, but if you are someone working in the footprint of Helene right now or anywhere else that's been affected by large floods, I highly recommend checking out his document called Giving Our Rivers Room to Move. It's in the Vermont Journal of Environmental Law. Just Google Mike Klein, Giving Our Rivers Room to Move. It'll come up. Mike's been working on this stuff for 35 years, and this document is basically his magnum opus of what we've learned about restoring rivers in all scenarios, but particularly with an eye towards that inflection point in the state of Vermont with Tropical Storm Irene. So with that, as I said, I'm going to get the main takeaways right up front. What we've learned in the wake of Irene is that channels actually adjust quite rapidly to the increased sediment loads, and that adjustment happens without the need for human intervention. And when I say rapidly, I'm talking about on the order of months to a few years here, right? So it's not rapidly like 2 weeks. It does take some time, and it may be slower than we want as humans. But again and again, what we've seen in our research with these dam removals is the ecologic outcomes and the economic outcomes are better when instead of implementing a engineered stream design on the channel soon after the dam removal, or in this case, soon after a flood, if you instead allow the channel to adjust, you've spent less money because you didn't have to implement a design, and the ecologic outcomes are better. So I'm going to show you some data that supports that. The second point that I'm going to talk about tonight is that floods themselves do facilitate floodplain reconnection and channel complexity. And those two factors together will mitigate future floods. I'm going to show you some model results that highlight that. And finally, despite these first 2 points about river resilience, we have made many observations that in the wake of floods like Helene, like Irene, like the July 2023 floods in Vermont, like the Waverly, Tennessee floods of 2021, there are lasting effects on the landscape. And so we do have to adjust our baseline and think about how we might be operating in a more erosive world from now on. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. But before we do, we just got to have one slide on general theory, because I'm going to talk a little bit about channel equilibrium tonight. And this is basically the idea that rivers achieve a stable but dynamic form over a period of years. And so the way that I always try to encompass this is by saying, imagine the river that you grew up along. We all grew up along a river. I took the school bus along the Ottaquiche, the river that we just saw earlier in the slideshow. Despite Irene happening in the middle of my lifetime, when I go back there at the holidays to see my folks, that river has neither eroded into a Grand Canyon style form, nor has it degraded into some big sand dune, right? It's been roughly stable. Banks have eroded, bars have built, but that has been balanced. And so we can think about a river having some sediment supply, but that supply being balanced by some sediment transport. And together we call that a dynamic equilibrium, where on the whole, the river is able to transport the material that is supplied to it, and it adjusts its width, depth, and slope to be able to handle the load. So I'm going to use this term a little bit. I'm happy to talk about it more, but we won't dive too deeply into that science, but that's our little science background. So dam removals. I'm going to show you a little bit of data. And I think that I'm not too presumptuous to say that dam removals are a really good analog for large floods because, as like I said, we are dealing with the same issues: no vegetation and a ton of sediment. That's the name of the game post flood, right? So there've been a lot of work on dam removals in the last few decades, but a lot of it has been qualitative, observational, which is extremely useful. But what we endeavored to do at Dartmouth in my lab group was to think a little bit more quantitatively about how we can quantify river equilibrium to actually track the time it takes for a river to recover on its own versus with an engineered design. And so here's a complicated graph that I'm going to try to make simple. Our y-axis is river condition. Our x-axis is time. And we observed this dam for 6 years, pretty long study. But rather than get confused on the units on the river condition, I only want you to pay attention to this dotted line at 1.0. That's the equilibrium line. And what I'm showing you here in this first one is the upstream control reach above all of our dam removal sites. So that was not affected by the removal of the dam. And as you can see, it's basically at equilibrium the whole time, right? It's adjusting slightly over that 6-year period, but it's never going totally out of whack. Now let's compare that with what happened in the wake of the dam removal. That's our analogy for a flood in the reservoir and downstream reaches. So what we see right away is that there is this pretty wacky period here in the first 6 months where the channel is totally overwhelmed with sediment, way out of equilibrium in the negative direction, and then overcompensates way out of equilibrium in the positive direction. But rather than get hung up on that, what I'd actually like to highlight is, given the magnitude of the disturbance, 100 years of sediment just suddenly available to the river. That's a huge disturbance. Given that magnitude, this river actually arcs back towards an equilibrium form within about 1.5 to 2 years, which I'd argue is quite rapid and is much more rapid than expectations were when we started removing dams around the turn of the century. Now, the interesting observation here is that there is this second half of the recovery period where the river gets close to equilibrium, but not quite there. And what happened that finally pushed us close to equilibrium is that we did have this large flood in the end of our study period. And in that case, it was actually a benefit because it brought in sediment that was stranded higher than the active channel. It brought in wood that didn't exist previously. It built steps in pools and riffles that didn't exist beforehand. And so the lesson here is, as river restoration practitioners, we're best to allow the river to adjust on its own in this first period. What I like to say is maximize the channel's degrees of freedom. Give it sediment, give it wood, and allow it to rearrange that furniture. And then in this second half of the restoration arc, that's where we have a role to play, where we can add structural elements like wood. We can make sure that there is sediment available, that the river is not just stranded from those old sediments. We can do riparian plantings, things like that. So the lesson takeaway from here is that channels are pretty dang resilient, and they're able to adjust to quite catastrophic amounts of sediment quite quickly. And as practitioners, the best thing we can do is allow that adjustment to occur without getting in the way by trying to build a channel that we think looks just right or has the perfect depth pools. All that said, of course, with a caveat that we can't do this everywhere, right? There are places where we don't have those degrees of freedom. There's where I'm from, right? In Vermont, all these towns are built in the valleys because it's a legacy of the Industrial Revolution. That's where the mills were, right? That's true in many places across the East Coast. It's a legacy of logging or agriculture, you name it. We have built in the floodplain. And so the lesson there is not that we should maximize degrees of freedom everywhere at the cost of our infrastructure, but rather we should maximize the degrees of freedom for the channel where we're able to, and stabilize and reduce complexity where we have to, in floodplain towns, for example. So on that last point of increased connection and complexity, we know, as I've said, that our rivers are often channelized and devoid of structure as a legacy of this kind of, the land use changes that have gone on since the colonial period. And we're told that if we restore rivers via flooding or via, human intervention, that we actually will have more resilient floodplains in the future. But the question that we had was, does this actually work, right? Like, this is a story that is hard for folks to buy, because if your house has just been destroyed by Tropical Storm Irene or Helene, you're not going to be keen to be told, hey, actually, we need to kind of let the river stay in this form. It's going to reduce flooding in the future. You're going to be inclined to go grab the dump truck and the backhoe and get going, do something about it. And that's how I would feel. That makes a lot of sense. So, cognizant of that, we wanted to provide some data that could actually demonstrate this beyond just the kind of, hand wavy science that, folks like me have been guilty of for a long time. So what we did is we looked at the Otter Creek watershed in West Central Vermont. Now, this is an ideal test for this question of how floodplain connectivity, stream complexity, and restoration in general can or cannot mitigate floods in the future. And so that's the question we asked. Do connected floodplains mitigate floods? So the flow is going from the bottom of our screen to the top here, and Rutland is in the middle of this watershed, the middle upper part. And above Rutland in the watershed, there is almost no accessible floodplain. So you can see there the green are woody wetlands, and there's just not a lot of them above Rutland. But below Rutland, there are these extensive woody wetlands before the town of Middlebury. And so the theory is, well, Middlebury should be buffered. These wetlands should work to absorb some of that water during floods and attenuate the peak, make it lower. So that's exactly what these folks did. They modeled flows in different climate change scenarios in the near future, mid future, and far. Let's just focus on the far. That's the most catastrophic one that we can think of. So it's fun to think about. So in that scenario in Rutland, we see a peak flow of 550 cubic meters per second. That's not CFS, that's cubic meters per second. So that's CFS times 35 point something, right? So this is a huge flood. If that area between Middlebury and Rutland were just farm fields that we allowed to buffer the flood, we'd get a peak that's slightly lower. So that's better, but it's still not great. It's still a really big damaging flood with high velocities and depths. If we leave it as it is in these woody wetlands, then we get even lower flood, but it's still pretty big. If we restore areas that are restorable, meaning they don't have existing infrastructure already, they're ag land right now and could be converted to woody wetlands, or they are an old railroad grade that could be taken out so that the wetland behind it could be reconnected. If we did that, we would decrease the peak discharge during this catastrophic 100-year event by half. Instead of a peak discharge of 550 CFS, we would have a peak discharge of about 250 CMS, cubic meters per second. That's a huge difference. So reconnecting the floodplain really makes a big difference quantitatively, and we have the data to prove that, which is exciting. So the takeaway here is, in this moment where we are, or in any moment where you're working to restore streams after a flood, we need to work with the agencies that are going to be doing the work on the ground, the Department of Transportation, FEMA, anyone else who's out there, to kind of preserve the reconnection that's been brought by the floodplain and the structural enhancement that's resulted from the flood by bringing in wood and other features, and protect and restore that connection where we can. Again, on agricultural land or national forest land, or landowners who are keen to be participants in this kind of work, and then limit the disconnection, kind of riprap strategies, to the places where it is essential. And it is essential in places, right? Floodplain towns. I want to keep emphasizing that we've got to be thoughtful about the watershed as a whole. We can't lose sight of what's happening at one point for what's happening at the watershed. We can't reconnect everywhere. It's just the reality of our world. All right, so last chapter here of this talk, the lasting effects of these floods. So my collaborator and friend, Evan DeChair, pictured here, has been monitoring the suspended sediment flux. That's the stuff that floats in the water, makes it look like chocolate milk. It's too big to be dissolved, and it's too small to fall out of the sediment. So clays, silts, sands, that kind of material. He's been monitoring that flux in watersheds in Central Vermont since Irene for 13 years. And so here I'm just emphasizing the scale of this event. So Irene was truly a devastating event in our neck of the woods, kind of off the charts here. And what happened as a result of Irene, beyond the immediate flooding, is that over 900 landslides were triggered in a single day. So we calculated that's about 30 years worth of landslides happening in one day, August 28th, 2011. This is what they look like. They're not small. They're not just a little tiny eroding bank. These things are 20 meters tall, so over 60 feet tall in some places. And, adding dump trucks load of sediment, even at small flows nowadays. So what we did is we located all of these in two paired watersheds, the White River watershed and the Williams River watershed in Central Vermont. And we put these turbidity probes that measured suspended sediment constantly for years. And we also went out to the landslides and used terrestrial LiDAR. That's just a high resolution topography scan to look at how sediment was eroding from these landslides. And what we found is that even in this hydrologically quiescent period, we didn't really have any floods for 5 or 6 years after Irene. We were still losing meters of sediment from these hill slope failures every year. And that's because even at low flows, they would tickle the slope or the toe of the landslide and a huge block would fall in. And so it was as if the flood was happening continually for years, even though the event was only a single day. So we actually quantified that. Here's some confusing graphs to really shock the system. But again, I'm going to try to make them simple. On the X, we just have discharge, that's flow, how much water, versus the suspended sediment flux. So basically, X-axis is flow, Y-axis is how much dirt do we have. And there are two trends on here. Black is pre-Irene, green is post-Irene. And what you'll notice is pre-Irene, for a given flow, we had much less sediment than we do after. Those red arrows, that's what we have after. For a given flood size now, we are seeing about 2 orders of magnitude more sediment in even 10 years after the flood. And the same is true even on the Connecticut River, which is a highly regulated system, tons of dams on the Connecticut. So it's not limited to just these small headwater streams. Here's the graph that I think really shows it best. This is the amount of sediment flux in megatons over time since 1970. And basically, we can see that things were pretty steady up until Irene. And then after Irene and in the decades since, we've been living in a new reality where even small floods are resulting in a lot of sediment moving. And again, at the very beginning, I mentioned that Irene wasn't the only major event that we had in these watersheds that we've been studying. We were hit again in July 2023. And there was a lot of sediment moved in that event. This picture at right, as a geomorphologist, it's one of my favorites because I came to the site in the morning and there was no sediment on the bank. And I came back and there had been 2 feet of sediment aggraded from the stream that's normally about 4 inches deep. And it had both deposited all that sediment and eroded through it in the few hours that I'd been there. So it's just highly dynamic system going on. And it just gives a sense for, if that's being transported in 2 hours, what's being transported over the course of the event. Quite a lot of stuff. So these are the samples that were collected. I was out there literally in my Toyota Prius chasing the flood around the state, trying to get samples, and they're off the charts. So the point being here that the amount of sediment that we're seeing moved post-Irene is just a whole new reality. And we quantified that by thinking about, what's the ways that landslides recover? Well, landslides recover by becoming vegetated, stabilized, right? And so we took satellite imagery of every single one of those 900 landslides over the last, since we've had high resolution imagery of the area, so 2017. So been about 6-7 years or so. And what we saw is that in every year from 2017 to 2022, we were seeing revegetation and recovery. So I should clarify that on this graph, towards the bottom is more vegetation just because of this index that we use, and the top is less vegetation. So we saw in July, looking at month here on the bottom, right? So this is the whole year, not a lot of veg in January or December, but quite a bit in July. So in July, things were getting greener and greener year after year. We were just starting to recover. And then July 2023 floods hit. And that's that yellow line, right? So all of a sudden, we're totally back to where we started post-Irene. This flood comes, the landslides are reinitiated, and it's like Irene happened yesterday. So what I want to close on here is that despite the rapid recovery to equilibrium conditions, channel behavior and fluxes might be altered to some kind of new baseline, new normal. And that is a reality that's important to recognize as a river restoration practitioner, because we need to be able to communicate that change to set expectations. Because it is also true, as I emphasized earlier, that floods are positive. They do bring floodplain connection, and they do bring channel complexity. And rivers are resilient, and they do adapt, but there are some changes that are persistent. And so what can we do? Well, the reality is that when you have a persistent 65-foot high landslide, that's probably not going to be something that we're gonna fix very easily. And so the reality is we're going to have to work around it. And to move infrastructure away from these erosional hotspots, the state of Vermont is still having to set back roads away from these propagating landslides. But the fact that rivers are transporting more sediment than they ever have isn't necessarily a horrible thing. It's not like the rivers are muddy every day. It's only during these flood events a couple times a year. So it's not bad for fish. And remember that we've been living in this sediment-starved world for a few centuries, where rivers have been disconnected from their floodplains. So sediment supply is also part of the solution. We need more sediment in streams so that we can build bars, banks, riffles, deep pools for trout, and all sorts of things. So yes, floods do change things irreparably in some cases, but if we're thoughtful about those changes, they don't have to be a nail in the coffin. So I'm just going to summarize those takeaways here. But what I want to end on is that despite emphasizing the science, it's not the most important thing. And what I mean by that is we can talk all day, and I'd be happy to actually talk about this precise restoration strategy that is going to be the best to restore this river. But the number one thing we can do is protect the river corridor. As Ellen Wool said, Ellen Wool's a big name in the geomorphology world, kind of the queen bee. She wrote a paper just this summer, restoring factors that create river corridor resilience is more difficult than protecting these features. So here at Trout Unlimited, we focus a lot on restoration, and I'm not trying to poo-poo that. It is a really important work, and I'm excited to be a part of it. But in the places where we have river complexity and floodplain connection already, the best thing we can do is not throw the dump trucks down there, is instead try to protect that and allow the river to, again, rearrange the furniture in such a way, and then we can come in and fine tune. So that the same sentiment is true with these landslides. If your house is built at the edge of a landslide, you are obviously going to want to do something about stopping that, and that is totally natural. I would feel the exact same way. But it is important to keep the context in mind that these landslides are a symptom of the fact that river corridors in the state of Vermont were channelized and did produce really high velocities that led to an incredible amount of landslides. And that if we put rivers back into that channelized form, we're going to repeat this cycle of more and more landslides. Whereas if we give rivers room to move upstream, that will mitigate downstream flows and reduce the number of landslides in the future. So finally, I'm going to bring it back to Mike Klein. He's a lot wiser than I am. He's been working on this stuff for a long time. And he makes a good point here, which is this. What began in 2003, this is pulled right from his Give Rivers Room to Move. He wrote, what began in 2003 would be the work of generations of Vermont river managers, getting Vermonters to embrace an avoidance approach, giving rivers room to move, and managing towards natural dynamic equilibrium conditions and the natural processes that will minimize erosion over time. Changing the centuries-old paradigm that the only safe and productive river was a structurally managed river would take compelling place-based river stories supported by data. I want to emphasize that could explain the benefit and cost of a passive versus active restoration program. I like this because it emphasizes something that is the key part to end on here, and that's that science isn't the hurdle. I've spent a lot of time talking about science tonight, and I apologize. I do get excited about that. You'll have to forgive me. But what really needs to happen are folks like you all who care about the rivers that you live along, that know the watershed that you grew up in or that you live in now like the back of your hand. And the biggest difference probably isn't going to be made by folks like me waving graphs around, but in fact, the biggest difference might be just showing up when the trucks roll in. The best example I have of this is I just spoke with one of our project managers who is based out of Red Lodge, Montana yesterday. And so her work is focused on restoring rivers in the wake of the 2022 Yellowstone floods, which were, they didn't affect as much infrastructure because it was in Yellowstone, but they were some of the most severe floods we have seen in any of our lifetimes. 1 in a 500-year event, conservatively. And her work has been focused on not undoing the damage of the flood, but like we saw in Vermont, undoing the damage of the restoration that took place after. FEMA hired contractors to remove debris from rivers. Those contractors in Montana were paid by the truckload. So of course they were incentivized to take anything out, wood, sediment, large rocks, that counted as debris, and they were paid by the truck. So it's the simple things, being able to be there when the trucks are rolling and have a conversation about, hey, this wood is actually going to help mitigate floods in the future. Like, let's try to focus on taking out wood that's right above town that might actually be a threat, or right above this culvert, and leave the stuff that is up here in the national forest land. Let's leave that alone. So unfortunately, I don't have a silver bullet, but it is, again, the kind of place-based knowledge that's going to make the biggest difference. So the fact that you are all on here on an evening speaks to the fact that you care a lot. And I think that's what's going to make the biggest difference. And so thanks for listening to me jabber on. That's all I've got. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to chat more about it.
Hey, Jordan. So it looks like Bruce Bailey asked early on what you meant by when you say add wood, and I believe you might have just covered it.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that, because I mentioned that in the context of the dam removals, right? And I said these rivers are going to adjust rapidly on their own, but towards the back end, they could use a little bit of structure. And so what I mean by that is floodplain connection and stream complexity are two sides of the same coin. And so when we add wood in the sense of taking a large log and anchoring in the bank, something with like an engineered log jam is the fancy term for it. You might hear ELJ thrown around. What that can do is actually promote scour behind that, which mobilizes sediment to build a bar downstream. It produces a pool behind that piece of wood that's good for habitat. Maybe it erodes a bank across the river and reconnects the floodplain a little bit more. And that would, in the context of either a flood that's removed all the wood or a dam removal where it's a reservoir, so there was no wood, is playing a really important role, but the river wouldn't get there on its own quickly. It would require trees growing and falling into the river in the case of a dam removal. So that's where humans really can play a really positive role, by kind of, like I said, fine tuning, thinking about how we can add structure and complexity without really bringing out the big guns unless we have to.
Excellent. Well, you really did a great presentation. Thank you. We've got a question from Tim Shaw in the Q&A. If you want to open that, take a look.
Yes, definitely. Wait, is that different than the chat? Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Let's see. Q&A, perfect. USDA Forest Service studies predict more drought and flood conditions in the Northeast due to climate change. Any proactive actions we can consider for our native cold water streams? Our local stream volume has varied from 5 to 3,000 CFS in the past 3 years. I bet Tim's observation is true for many of you, many of the streams that you all live along, and it's variability. That's the name of the game here in the climatic moment we find ourselves. There are no places that will be strictly drought stricken or strictly affected by floods. Even places like California that we think about drought all the time, floods are a real threat for them. And I think that proactive actions that we can do are river restoration or river corridor protection that results in those two factors, floodplain connectivity and stream complexity. And the reason I'll say that is in a flood, as I've described, water and sediment are stored and they then are released slowly. That decreases the peak flow. But on the other hand, in a drought, when the stream is really low, if the floodplain has been well connected, water is being stored in the ground nearby all year long. So in the spring, it infiltrates into the ground. And when water is really low, that cold water from the groundwater can actually start to seep out into the stream. And so it's pretty cool that floodplain restoration is neither just for the benefit of floods, nor just for the benefit of droughts, but it can do both. And so I would say that if there are places where, there are landowners who are amenable to restoration in your neck of the woods, or, land trusts own property, those are the places to start, the low hanging fruit. The place not to start is where someone has their patio hanging over the river. They're probably not going to want you to come and wreck their house for the sake of the floodplain.
Sure.
Um, cool.
Excellent.
Bruce Bailey had another question in the Q&A I'll go for here. The North Carolina flooding stripped away tree canopy. What is the potential impact on the stream? Really good question. I think that this is one that a lot of folks are excited to study because we don't know. And I can hypothesize a lot of things that might happen. One thing that I'm worried about, and I know anglers worry about a lot, is stream temperature, right? We know that especially in these southeast regions, salmonid trout species, they rely on that cold, clear water in the headwaters. And if it's exposed to sunlight for a longer period of time, we might see higher stream temperatures. The flip side of that, though, Bruce, is that if the canopy's been stripped away, it means wood's been added to the stream. And so we might see the preservation of more habitat because now there's wood in the stream and pools will scour. There will be shade underneath those trees in the stream. And so while the canopy is gone, and that we do want that to recover, it's not, I'm not trying to dismiss that, it's a real effect. But my positive take is that hopefully there's a give and take here. There's going to be some recovery time, but not all hope is lost. There has hopefully been a benefit as well that might mitigate the damage of that loss of canopy.
Got another one in the Q&A too.
Okay. It's a longer one, so let me read it and then summarize. Okay, awesome. Shay is an aquatic ecologist at App State in Boone, North Carolina. Wow, psyched to hear about your work sometime. On the eastern edge of the Hurricane Helene impacts. And TU chapters from that region are asking about the information about impacts on aquatic macroinvertebrates in fish stocks. And they're saying in the 6 weeks since the flooding, we are seeing intact fish and invertebrate assemblages. 2 questions. What is known from the literature on expected impacts? And 2, how would the season of flooding impact eastern trout populations? So I got to caveat this with, I'm a rocks and rivers guy, not the fish guy. We've got some awesome fish people here at TU, and unfortunately, that's not me. But it's good. I know my place at least. But I'm gonna do my best here. And I will say that in that dam removal study that I highlighted today, we did study macroinvertebrate populations in tandem with an ecologist at Dartmouth. And what was really cool was, despite the high sediment fluxes as were happening post-flood, which we would normally think about as kind of being a disturbance to these invertebrate assemblages that rely on a certain substrate size and structure, they actually recovered really rapidly. And what's cool is it sounds like you're seeing the exact same thing on the ground. So I feel like I could learn more from you on this in some cases. That's really cool that you're seeing intact fish. In terms of the season of flooding on eastern brook trout, which is the second question, I do think that one is a bit out of my wheelhouse. But I will say that fish are flood adapted species. These kind of events aren't new to them. They've survived for millennia. I mean, that's not even fair. Eons, millions, tens of millions of years, we've had certain trout species here in North America. And as an aquatic ecologist, that floods are actually a really important signal for all sorts of aquatic organisms to distribute them to different parts of the watershed, to in the spring when there's a spring flood to move downstream, and in the case of salmon to go out to sea and things like that. So the fact that you're seeing intact assemblages is really encouraging to me, but not surprising, because I always like to say that these systems are way more flexible, malleable, and resilient than we give them credit for. And I think that's something that makes me feel hopeful in the wake of these floods. So anyway, thanks for a great question. Sorry for a lame answer, but I'll point you to the best folks to answer those.
That's right. And I wanted to mention that David Lynch lives in Massachusetts and fishes in Vermont and is a Dartmouth alumni.
Oh,
And
right on.
it's and proud of the awesome work you did there. And thanks for all you do.
Thanks, Dave. Great to hear from you. And now that I see that in the chat, there's one more question I'm seeing in there.
Oh, yep.
Um, Joseph Gabriel says, have you observed the effectiveness of forest buffers in headwater creeks of a watershed? I'm a junior engineer in Syracuse, New York area, and one of our public sector clients has us working on a fairly unstable creek in the area. After looking at aerials of the whole watershed, I've noticed that many tributaries and headwater reaches are totally unforested. Do you think there could be an effective solution here? Wow, this is such an awesome question because it gets to that last part, second to last slide where I said we got to think about the disease rather than just the symptoms, right? So Joseph's client here is thinking about a symptom, right? An unstable stream section where banks are eroding, presumably it's maybe affecting their driveway or house or who knows. I absolutely think that the deforestation in the headwaters is making a difference because two things. One, there's the kind of floodplain connectivity that I've talked about, right? But the other thing is when the headwaters are deforested, there's less evapotranspiration, right? Trees are respiring, they are absorbing water and breathing it out. And so there's a lot of studies, actually older ones, and as far back as the 70s, that show when you deforest a watershed, you have much higher peak flows, both because of that floodplain storage phenomenon that I emphasize today, but also because trees do a really good job of absorbing water. If you look at a hydrograph of a forested region like in Vermont, the day the leaves come on, flow drops by like 30%. So if you look at like April 15th to May 15th in northern New England, you'll see the sudden just drop, and that's because the leaves came on. So in your watershed, which is in a very similar setting to the places I've talked about today, I think an effective solution would be to think at the watershed scale. I know that's kind of a tough answer given that as an engineer, you're hired to think about a point, right? And your client lives in an exact spot. But if you're able to work with those landowners higher up to think about, putting in a riparian buffer of trees and things like that, it might be a better long-term way to go.
Excellent. There was another one from Bob Irvin in the Q&A.
Okay. Bob says there have been several dam removals in the White River since Irene, but several dams remain on the Aquatic. Has there been a difference in flood impacts since the dam removals? Great question. Bob, you'll have to let us know where you're from because you sound familiar with the area, which is cool. Good to have a local on there. So there have been a difference in flood impacts, and the White River is actually the largest undammed river in New England, which is pretty cool. Even the fabled rivers way up north, the St. John and the Allagash, have some little tiny dams on them. But so the White River is pretty cool in that respect. And I would say that the dams in the Ottaquechee are interesting because they're not flood control dams. They're primarily these older dams that are full of sediment. I'm thinking about the Mill Dam in Quechee, Vermont. And for folks not from this area, these are dams that were built for textile mills where there are large brick buildings right next to the river with a dam that would have diverted water and powered a mill. And if you think about these particular areas on the Ottaquechee, the places where we had the most severe impacts, like the town of Quechee, are the places where these dams are, right? Simon Pierce is a restaurant that's built in this old mill. It's flooded every time that we've had these floods. So, I'm not saying all dams are bad, right? Dams do serve a flood control purpose. But in the case of the Ottaquechee, where the dams are old and full of sediment, they're not storing any sediment or any water during a flood. And so there's a big part of the community identity is based around the existence of these dams. So who knows if they'll come out or not, if ever. But they're not mitigating floods in any way, I would say. I wouldn't say that, and I would say that they probably pose a risk because they're very old and could fail if we keep seeing floods like this.
That's fascinating. I don't
Great
see.
questions.
Let me look back through. Yeah, feel free to post more if you have a question for Jordan.
Really appreciate everyone hanging out and
Yeah.
listening. It's been really cool to, thanks for plugging the Mike Klein thing there.
Yep.
That's a good one if folks are interested in kind of taking a deeper dive than the survey I gave today.
Well, that was excellent. Thank you so much. If we have missed anything, I'll go back through this to see if there's any other questions that I might have missed and make sure that Jordan gets them. But thanks everybody for showing up. If you've got another question, feel free to post it. But we will also share this recording in the open forum and the leaders forum. So feel free to reach out if you have questions about that. And thanks again for attending.
Awesome. And yeah, last thing is my email was on a lot of the slides, so feel free to reach out if you've got site place specific questions. I'd be happy to chat about it. So thanks all.
And there is something from John Rich if you want to answer that real quick, but we can also
Oh yeah.
answer.
Yeah, I've got time. Folks don't need to stay on, but I'll answer John's question here. What happens to streams that have been stripped to bedrock? Great question. So what I'd say is that's not an ideal stream condition in most places. You know, we do have bedrock streams, but in a place that had sediment before and stripped after, that's not going to be an ideal. However, what I'd say is that's likely a point problem, right? And if we think about the watershed scale again, symptom versus disease, if we think about the watershed scale, there's likely sediment sources upstream. So I'd be interested, John, if you know a spot that's been stripped to bedrock by a flood near you, I'd be interested to see whether that persists as a bedrock reach or if over time sediment makes its way downstream and kind of self-heals that reach. That would be my intuition. But it's also possible that that reach kind of becomes just a little bedrock reach and fish just move through it. They don't spend time there. That's possible. Hopefully the entire river hasn't been stripped to bedrock. That would be shocking and saddening. So if that's happened, let me know. I'd be interested to hear about that.
True. And I've seen I'm fortunate enough to fish the Green River here in Utah, and they obviously open up the floodgates to flush out the stream to help with invasive, but also
Yeah.
to mimic some flooding. So it is
Yeah, the
fascinating to
Colorado
watch.
River system has done a lot of that experimentation with the what we call the natural flow regime, trying to simulate those floods to give native species like Colorado pike minnow and roundtail chub the signal they need to spawn. Jeff makes another great point to John's question that part of their strategic wood loading work down in the southeast is to do exactly that, a grade bed material in the type of areas that have been scoured to bedrock. So I want to point out that Jeff's one of our project managers down in the southeast, and he's doing really cool work on this stuff and is really an expert. So if you're in that area, look to him.
Absolutely. Well, I believe that is it. I
Great.
will. We appreciate you taking the time to present this, Jordan. It's definitely worth the time. Looks like Bob Irvin popped in another.
Oh, right on. I'll follow up with Bob. I'll see if I can
Perfect.
get his contact and follow up with him. So um,
Excellent.
thanks to everyone, and thanks to you, Doug.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. This is great. I appreciate it.
Great. I'll stop the share here and we'll call it an evening.
All right. We will shut it down.